Hello everyone and welcome to the video. In this video, we're going to be covering one final topic that needs to be understood, at least in this context, in the case of SOAP-based web services, and that is the WSDL, specifically its language syntax. So again, you might be a little bit confused. I mentioned this in the previous video, but I'm now going to be extrapolating a little bit more on that, because if you understand this, performing a security test on a SOAP-based web service becomes much easier, and you'll be able to much more effectively analyze the methods supported or allowed by a web service, and also try and play around or invoke hidden methods. And that's something we'll actually be exploring when we go into the next section of the course, where we'll actually be taking a look at lab examples and essentially going through the process, the web security, the web service security testing methodology. So to begin with, before I even get to the WSDL, we need to understand a couple of things. So a web service is characterized by the following. Number one or more methods. All right, what is a method? We'll get to that, but each of these methods reflects a service provided by the server or application. So a method, essentially, you can think of it as a particular type of functionality, right? That, again, can be configured when developing the web service. So let's say you want your web service to essentially be able to facilitate or allow the listing of usernames. That would be considered a method. And in that case, we can then abuse that method to enumerate users. Again, very, very simple example of why someone would create it. Well, not really why, but an example of a method within a SOAP web service, and how an attacker could use it to their advantage. A protocol, on the other hand, defines the structure of each message used to request a service. So the protocol defines the structure. So the structure behind the request that contains the method. Okay. So the structure of a message sent by the web service in the response. That's the second thing it defines. And lastly, the protocol defines the transport method used to transmit the messages. So what I'm essentially doing here with this diagram is putting together all the pieces, more specifically, the important pieces. So when I say method, just think of it as functionality. A web service can have whatever functionality you want. If you want if you're developing a web service, you can create a method to display the system time, or to get the system time, I should say, where you make the request, specify the method, and then within the response, the system time will be sent back. And you can now start to understand the advantage of using web services, and why, communication between two or more systems, computers in this case, is much more straightforward. I really like how they communicate. A protocol, on the other hand, defines the structure of each message used to request a service, the structure of a message sent by the web service in response, the transport method used to transmit the messages. So method is essentially what you want to do, or a piece of functionality. The protocol defines how this is structured or formatted, how it is transmitted, and ensures that both of these systems are essentially communicating or are on the same page in terms of communication. And it does that through the formatting and, of course, the transport method. So that brings us to the WSDL. The WSDL, which stands for Web Services Description Language, is an XML-based language that is used to describe the functionality and interface of a web service. WSDL documents serve as contracts between service providers and consumers, specifying how a web service can be used. So as I said, generally speaking, when you develop a web service, let's say in isolation, you can go ahead and implement it and not provide the WSDL. The problem with that is that one day, someday, another developer may be required to improve that web service or to test it. If they don't understand what methods you created or what methods are supported, they cannot interact with that web service. So web service or the WSDL document is essentially just that. It is documentation on the web service that'll tell you how this works, okay? And remember, based on who is consuming the WSDL or whether or not it is publicly exposed, many developers will hide or will not include methods that could be potentially dangerous. And that's where we get into the testing process that involves trying to identify or invoke hidden methods that will allow us to do something different. So the point here is that WSDLs are an industry standard that you need to provide, or that are typically provided, because again, on a machine-to-machine basis, the communication is fine. But if you want to understand how it works, what are the supported methods, you need to have documentation. So WSDL is commonly used in conjunction with SOAP to define and document SOAP-based web services. And this is also the case with APIs, specifically RESTful APIs, where in certain cases the docs or the documentation will be exposed in the form of the doc endpoint, where you can learn about how this API works, so that you can, either interact with it or even integrate it into your own web application. Now, one other thing that you need to be aware of, and this is very important, and that is that WSDL has different versions. So as of the time me writing this slide, WSDL can be distinguished into two main versions. We have 1.1 and 2.0. Although 2.0 is the current version and the most widely adopted version, many older web services, especially in the financial sector, still utilize WSDL 1.1. It doesn't mean that one is superior over the other. It's just language changes. Therefore, what that means in the next slides, we'll actually see the differences between the two so that this becomes clearer to you. Now, before we even take a look at the differences between the two versions, first of all, it is important to know that WSDL documents have abstract and concrete definitions. In the case of abstract, they describe what the service does, such as the operation provided, the input, the output, and the fault messages used by each operation. So this is now how WSDLs are defined, all right? And you then have the concrete definitions, which add additional information about how the web service communicates and where the functionality is offered. And you'll usually see these two forms of exposure in terms of you being able to find the WSDL. In the case of the abstract definition, it's exactly that. It's very abstract regarding functionality offered, but more so just highlights what the web service does at a high level. In this case, an example is the operation provided, the input, the output, and the fault messages. Whereas with concrete WSDL documents, this adds additional information about how the web service communicates and where functionality is offered. And it'll also go deeper into supported methods, so on and so forth. So this will all make sense when we actually get our hands wet, which we are soon. So the following image shows the main differences between WSDL 1.1 and WSDL 2.0 definitions. We will inspect the most important elements in the future. So WSDL 1.1, you can see here in terms of how it works. And then, of course, you have the abstract description and the concrete description. So WSDL definition is right over here. So this is what an abstract description would look like, where you have the types, the message, and then the port type. I'll explain what each of these means. And then the concrete description, you have the binding and then the service. And then for WSDL 2.0, for the abstract description, you'll have types and then the interface. For concrete, you'll have the binding and then the service and then the endpoint, which again, you don't need to understand in terms of the differences. What you need to understand are these tags here. And I'll explain what they mean in the context of XML, but also literally. So moving or exploring a little bit more about WSDL documents, a WSDL document is typically created to describe a SOAP-based web service, and it defines the service's operations, their input and output message structures, and how they are bound to the SOAP protocol. The WSDL document effectively documents the web service or API provided by the actual service, And the WSDL document serves as a contract between the service provider, which I already stated, and the consumers. And it specifies how clients should construct SOAP requests to interact with the service. This contract defines the operations, the input parameters, and expected responses. So this contract essentially defines the operations, their input parameters, and the expected responses. So in terms of the interaction between the client and the web service, and again, a client can be another system. In this case, I'm just putting a human being there just so that it makes much more sense in terms of where you, as the attacker, come into play. You can see that the web service comprises of the web service itself. So think of the actual code, the logic, etc. The WSDL description is a separate document or resource that tells you how this works. So the bottom line is, before you even begin testing a web service or even an API, you should always try and see whether the WSDL file is exposed. Okay? If it is, it'll tell you a lot about, or I should say, it will tell you, it'll essentially tell you more about how the web service works and how to interact with it than you would have found out had you tried to enumerate functionality manually. So you make a request for the WSDL file, you then get it, you analyze it, you now know, or you now understand how this works, what requests can be made, what can't be done, and then you then make your request to the actual web service. If it is legitimate, you get a response, and this is where you then perform the testing based on what you learned from the WSDL document. So it's very, very simple now, using this diagram to understand what exactly the flow is from the perspective of just, firstly a client, but also a web application penetration tester that's testing a web service, that's performing a security test on a web service, or I can't call it a web app pen test, but a web service pen test. I think it's much better to call it an API pen test, but there I go again, interchanging the terms or using them interchangeably, and I won't do that again, I promise. So in terms of the components that make up, the actual WSDL, we have types, all right, which you saw earlier on. So the type section defines the data types used in the web service. It typically includes XML schema definitions that specify the structure and the constraints of the input and output data. You then have the message. This is sent in the message element. The message element defines the data structures used in the messages exchanged between the client and the service. Messages can have multiple parts, each with a name and type definition, referencing the types defined in the types section. The port type. The port type element describes the operations that the web service supports. Okay, so keep that in mind. Each operation corresponds to a method or function that a client can invoke. It specifies the input and output messages for each operation. So the each operation being performed corresponds to a method. Okay, so keep that in mind. It corresponds to a method or function that the client can invoke. So this is very important because the port types will define, within the WSDL document, will define what operations are supported, facilitated facilitated by a method. So it's just an additional abstraction. In essence, port type just means method, or just means what you can do, or what type of request you can invoke. Okay, so it's very, very simple. You then have the binding. All right, so the binding element specifies how the service operations are bound to a particular protocol, such as SOAP over HTTP. It defines details like the protocol, message encoding, and endpoint addresses. You then have the service element. The service element provides information about the service itself. It includes the service's name and its endpoint addresses, which is the URL where the clients can access the service. Okay, so whenever I've said endpoint, I'm primarily telling you that this is where you can interact with the web service. Speaking from the perspective of a web app pen test or someone testing the web service. So those are the components. Now let's take a closer look at them with examples. So in the case of the binding element, I'll just go over the definition one more time. The binding element specifies how the service operations are bound to a particular protocol, such as SOAP over HTTP. It defines details like the protocol, message encoding, and endpoint addresses. So if you take a look at what is highlighted in bold here, you can see firstly we have WSDL binding, and then the name is set to Hello Service SOAP 11 binding. In terms of the type is set to Hello Service port type, and then in here we have the service operation. So you can see SOAP binding transport is equal to HTTP schemas.xml. So essentially saying using SOAP is going over HTTP in this particular case, and then you can see soap.org SOAP HTTP style is equal to document is essentially the binding element is very important because it's essentially structuring the actual request. So how the requests are to be structured, what protocol they're supposed to be operating over in terms of SOAP. And based on this, again, there's nothing too complicated in here that you need to be worried of. Just understand what each of these elements do. That's the important thing. We then have the port type. So the port type element describes the operations that the web service supports. Each operation corresponds to a method or function that a client can invoke. It specifies the input and output messages for each operation. So again, when specifying the port type or the port type element, you can see that in this case, the name is set to Hello Service port type. This is an example. And then you would define the operation name. So you would, again, remember, methods are just operations. They're just additional layers of abstraction moving up. So in this case, we are defining an operation. The name of the operation is say hello. And then the input parameters, the input parameter for this particular operation is right over here. WSDL input message is equal to say hello request. For the output message equals say hello response. So just defining that. And then, of course, you close the elements or the tags here. We then have operations themselves, right? So the operation object defined within a port type represents a specific action that a service can perform. It specifies the name of the operation, the input message structure, the output message structure, and optionally faulty or fault messages that can occur during the operation. So you can see we have the operation object here, which is being defined. The name is just say hello. And then the SOAP operation, SOAP action is say hello, style is equal to document. WSDL input, SOAP body use literal. For output, we have SOAP body use literal. So again, this really will not make much sense to you right now because again, these are just examples, code snippets that logically speaking don't make sense. But once we're able to look at a couple of real world examples, they will. You can trust me or take my word for that or on that. We then have the interfaces, right? So instead of port type, and now this is where the distinction between WSDL 1.1 and 2 comes into play. So instead of port type, WSDL version 2 utilizes interface elements which define a set of operations representing an interaction between the client and the service. Each operation specifies the types of messages that the service can send or receive. So in WSDL v2.0, instead of port type being used, we now have the interface element, all right? So the unlike the old port type, interface elements do not point to messages anymore. It does not exist in version 2.0. Instead, they point to schema elements contained within the types element. So we're now getting into various forms of abstractions here. And before I even take you deeper than that, I would like to now actually show you what this looks like using a practical example. So we have now come to the end of the introductory section of this course, which was designed to essentially introduce you to web services, show you what they are, how they work, how they compare to APIs, and also web applications in general, and more importantly, what the implementations are, or how one would go about implementing a web service, what protocols are to be used for the implementation, how those protocols work in terms of their communication, and we obviously talked about the the link between, in this case, a SOAP web service and the WSDL, or, the WSDL document. With that being said, that brings us to the end of this video. And in the next section, we're now going to get started with the web service security testing section of this course. That'll, again, firstly introduce you to the web service security testing methodology or process, so you understand what you now need to do as a pen tester when testing a web service. And then we'll dive into real world examples through the use of labs, where you'll actually get to interact and test a SOAP based web service. So with that being said, that's going to be it for this video, and I will be seeing you in the next video.